All right, so we're diving into the world of IGen today, and honestly, after these excerpts from Jean Twenge's book IGen, I'm really interested to hear your take on all this.
Yeah, it's definitely got people talking.
It really does. It's like this whole generation born, between 1995 and 2012, they're already kind of shaking things up.
And it really makes you rethink those old ideas about what future generations even means, you know?
Yeah.
The oldest iGeners are out there starting careers, families, the whole 9 yards. It's not theoretical anymore. Their impact is happening right now.
Right, like it's here. And Twenge really drives home how different their childhoods were. I mean, even compared to millennials, like remember when high school was all about getting your driver's license so you could actually hang out with your friends on the weekends?
Yeah. And now we're seeing this decline in those like classic milestones that you're talking about. Less dating, driving later. Even the rates of teen drinking are way down. And it's not even just delaying these things for a lot of iGen. Those experiences just aren't happening at all, even as they get older into their 20s.
It's kind of wild, right? Makes you wonder, is this what Twenge calls the slow life? Is it like a conscious choice? Or is it more about the world they've grown up in? Because alongside all of that, we also see Twenge pointing to some pretty alarming mental health stuff, too.
And the timing of it all is really key here. Increased loneliness,
Yeah.
depression, suicide rates, all those things start spiking right when smartphones become like ubiquitous. It makes you think, are we dealing with a generation that's just fundamentally more risk averse, or have the risks themselves just totally changed for iGen?
See, that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating. So let's unpack this slow life thing a little bit more. On the one hand, you've got teens putting off those traditional markers of adulthood. But then on the other hand, there's all this anxiety about the future. It's like those delayed experiences are creating a whole different kind of pressure.
Yeah, it's like they're navigating a world with all these guardrails they didn't exactly sign up for.
Hmm.
Think about it. This is the generation that grew up with recessions, constant climate change warnings, school shootings all over their social media feeds.
That's pretty bleak when you put it that way.
It is bleak. So is it any wonder they're a bit hesitant to rush into the same version of adulthood that frankly seems kind of terrifying?
And then you add technology into the mix. Twenge found this direct link between screen time and loneliness, especially for iGen. Even when they're super connected online, it's not replacing actually hanging out face to face.
And the research is really clear on that teens who spend more time on social media say they feel lonelier, while those who prioritize actually being with their friends in person, they show way lower levels of loneliness. It's not just correlation either, we're seeing causation.
So we've got this generation that's less likely to hang out in person, more likely to be glued to their phones, scrolling through, everyone else's highlight reels.
And losing sleep what they're at it. Well, let's not forget, this is the generation that sleeps with their phones, constantly bombarded with notifications. Twenge argues that messing with their sleep just makes those mental health risks even worse.
Okay, so we've got this potential for a slower path to adulthood, this whole new way of socializing and thinking about risk and these rising mental health concerns. But where it gets really interesting is how all of this shapes iGen's values. Twenge talks about how this generation seems to prioritize safety over everything else. And that plays out in everything from their politics to their views on relationships.
It's more complicated than just calling them soft or coddled, though Twenge's research actually shows that iGen is more cautious in situations that could be dangerous.
Wow.
They're less likely to get in a car with someone who's been drinking, and they care more about safety features when they're choosing a car. So there's this weird tension between the perception that they're fragile and how they're actually assessing risk.
It's like they're redefining what safety even means.
Right.
And it's not just about physical safety. This is where the whole safe spaces and trigger warnings conversation comes in.
And that is a conversation that can get pretty heated. On the one hand, you've got iGen advocating for emotional safety. They want protection from ideas or situations they consider harmful. On the other hand, you have critics saying this is creating a culture of censorship, that it's stifling free speech and intellectual debate.
It's a lot to unpack. But one thing's for sure, this generation is not afraid to speak up about their need for emotional protection. But they also seem hesitant to give up their independence at the same time.
Exactly. And that ties right into their individualism. They're not just accepting the way things are, they're actively trying to shape their environments to match their values, which obviously has some interesting implications for how they view things like politics.
Oh yeah, this is where it gets interesting. iGen's politics don't really fit into those neat little boxes, do they? They're often labeled as liberal, but Twenge found some contradictions there.
And that's what makes this research so compelling. It forces us to challenge those assumptions. For example, while IGen tends to lean liberal on a lot of social issues, they're more likely to oppose gun control, national health care, even government regulation when it comes to things like the environment.
Wait, really? It's like they're picking and choosing their battles.
They are. The key takeaway here is their strong libertarian side. They really value individual liberty and autonomy above all else, which sometimes clashes with those traditional left-right political labels. They're wary of big government, yet they're still deeply concerned about social justice.
So how does a generation that values individualism so much approach something like politics, which requires people to work together?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And we'll have to dive into that right after this.
So we were talking about IGen's approach to politics, how they bring together this strong sense of individualism with a real passion for social justice. But it seems like that independent streak shows up in their career aspirations, too.
Oh, absolutely. And it makes total sense when you think about what they've witnessed. Twenge talks about how IGen saw millennials struggle with things like student debt and a really rough job market. So they're approaching work with this kind of pragmatism that we haven't really seen before.
It's like they're looking for stability and purpose right away, not just chasing after the biggest paycheck.
Exactly. They're less likely to have those like typical part-time jobs as teenagers.
Oh.
And it's not about a lack of ambition. It's more like they're redefining what success even means.
So instead of climbing that corporate ladder, they're drawn to careers that offer things like work-life balance or a chance to actually make a difference.
Right. We see that reflected in the fields they're interested in: healthcare, social work, even the arts. These are careers that match up with their values, even if it means not fitting into that traditional high-powered, high-paying mold.
Which is interesting because, like we were saying, they're not easily won over by just any cause. Twenge talks about this growing skepticism of institutions, even the ones that are usually aligned with social justice.
Yeah, it all comes down to authenticity. They're not persuaded by slogans or empty promises. They want to see action, measurable change, a real commitment to those values.
And that desire for authenticity, for experiences that feel genuine, it seems to carry over into how they spend their money, too.
Yeah.
Twenge found that this generation isn't as into status symbols as older generations were.
True. They're way more selective as consumers. Think about it. They grew up with targeted ads, influencer culture. They know when someone's trying to sell them something. So instead of chasing those flashy brands, they'd rather invest in experiences, relationships, things that bring actual value to their lives.
Like they're rewriting the rules on what it means to have it all. It's less about material things and more about living a life that feels meaningful and real.
Exactly. And speaking of meaningful connections, this is where it gets super interesting. How does a generation that's so focused on safety and self-reliance approach something as complicated as love and relationships?
Because let's be real, they haven't exactly been given a roadmap for navigating intimacy in the age of dating apps and social media, right?
Yeah, not really. And Twenge's research shows that they're approaching relationships more cautiously than we've seen before. They're dating less, having sex later, and they're more likely to identify as asexual or aromantic.
Which of course leads to those snap judgments. Are they just scared of commitment? Are they the commitment-phobe generation?
It's easy to jump to those conclusions, but it's more nuanced than that. It's not that they're afraid of commitment. It's more like they're redefining what that even means. They're more open to exploring different ways of being in relationships. They're questioning those traditional expectations around monogamy and marriage.
Like they're coming up with their own rules for love and intimacy.
Exactly. And don't forget, they became adults at a time when hookup culture was becoming more and more normalized. So they're navigating this really complex landscape where casual sex is more accepted, but they're also totally aware of the potential emotional downsides.
That's a lot to juggle, trying to figure out where you stand on those expectations while also trying to connect with people authentically when everything's so digital.
Right? And it's not just their own relationships that are changing either. Twenge talks about how IGen's values have the potential to completely change family life. They're getting married later, having kids later, and challenging traditional gender roles in ways that could have a ripple effect for generations.
It's like they're holding up a mirror to all those assumptions about what it means to build a life, a family, a future. But they're also inheriting a world that's dealing with some huge problems. Climate change, political polarization, economic inequality. How do they reconcile their own dreams with the realities of the world they're inheriting?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's exactly what makes understanding IGen so important. Their choices, their values, their actions. All of it has the power to shape the future.
Talk about pressure. But on a more personal level, what does it even look like to parent an IGen kid? How do you deal with their anxieties, their relationship with technology, their need for emotional safety, while also preparing them for adulthood?
We've talked about the challenges, but Twenge also points out some really good things about how they view mental health. They're more open to talking about their struggles, more likely to find professional help, and they're actively challenging the stigma around mental health.
Which is huge. But it takes a different kind of parenting style, doesn't it? One that puts emotional intelligence first, that encourages open communication, and maybe a little less judgment about how they choose to interact with the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that shift towards being more emotionally aware, that willingness to challenge the way things are, to demand better. It's not just about individual well-being. It has the potential to change the very fabric of our society.
And that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive into IGen. We're going to talk about how their values are playing out in the real world, from their approach to activism to their vision for a more inclusive future. Okay, so we spent the last two episodes really trying to understand IGen's perspective, their slow life, their relationship with technology, that interesting mix of individualism and a passion for social justice. Now let's talk about how it's all playing out like in the real world.
Because it's one thing to talk about values, right?
Hmm.
But seeing how they're actually trying to shape the world, that's where it gets really fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. Especially when you think about how they view activism. It's not exactly about, marching on Washington or going door to door, is it?
Definitely not. Twenge talks about how IGen uses the tools they grew up with. Social media, online petitions, even call-out culture. They're not afraid to use those platforms to talk about what matters to them, to organize protests, even hold those institutions accountable.
Which, of course, leads to that whole debate about hashtag activism and slacktivism. Is it all just for show, or can they really make a difference through those digital channels?
It's a whole new world, isn't it? But you have to think about the reach they have. They can connect with people who feel the same way all over the world. Their message gets amplified like crazy. They're challenging the powers that be in a way we haven't really seen before.
And yet we keep coming back to this tension. How do they reconcile that desire for collective action, for social change, with their need for individual autonomy?
It's a balancing act for sure. And one, they're still figuring out. They're really wary of groupthink, skeptical of authority figures, and incredibly protective of their personal freedom.
Yeah.
But they're also super empathetic, tuned in to social injustices, and they genuinely want a more equal world.
Right, and that's where things get really tricky. Twenge brings up some pretty charged examples of IGen's activism, like safe spaces on college campuses and the debates around microaggressions and trigger warnings.
Yeah, those are definitely topics that get people fired up. And it often comes down to a clash of values between generations. For a lot of IGen, these issues are central to their sense of safety and well-being. It's not just theoretical for them. It represents very real experiences of pain, trauma, exclusion.
And then on the flip side, you have people who see it as taking political correctness way too far. Like it's a threat to free speech, that it's oversensitivity bordering on fragility.
And this is where Twenge's perspective is so important. She doesn't shy away from how complex it is. She shows both sides,
Okay.
examines the arguments for and against safe spaces,
Yeah.
trigger warnings, even the whole idea of microaggressions.
It's a good reminder that you don't have to agree with someone to try to understand them. But if we can at least listen to those different viewpoints, have a conversation that's respectful, even when it's difficult.
That's got to be the first step, right? Because whether we agree with how they're doing it or not, IGen is making us confront some really important questions about how we build a society where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into IGen, what's the one big takeaway you want listeners to remember? If understanding this generation is key to understanding the future, what's the most important thing?
I'd say it's their absolute dedication to making the world a better place. They're not afraid to challenge the status quo, to demand better for themselves and for everyone coming after them. They're pushing for things like a fairer system when it comes to resources,
Yeah.
a more sustainable way of living, and just a more compassionate way of understanding each other.
It's a lot to take on, but it's pretty inspiring too. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's obvious that IGen's story is just getting started, and they're going to have a huge impact on the years to come.